They called it the cradle of cruelty, not because it was born evil, but because it chose to perfect it. Long before Rome dreamed of conquest, and before Babylon sang its hymns to glory, there was Assyria, the world's first empire of terror. And its legacy wasn't just blood on stone. It was psychological warfare, industrialized brutality, and the terrifying lesson that fear works. If fear could shape a civilization, what kind of world would it build? In the shifting sands of northern Mesopotamia, long before Caesar dreamed of empire or Christ was born in Bethlehem, there rose a people who did not flinch from blood. A people who didn't just conquer, they curated terror. That name, Assyria. A name still muttered in hushed tones through the corridors of archaeology and scripture alike. But they weren't born monsters, they became them. One decision, one victory, one corpse at a time. The story begins modestly. A city by a river, Ashur, mud brick buildings baking under the sun, surrounded by harsh plains and harder neighbors. The people of Ashur didn't possess the lush lands of the south or the romantic mythology of Babylon. They had drought, discipline, and a different sort of dream. They didn't build temples to love or poetry. They built temples to war. Their god Ashur was no gentle deity. He didn't whisper peace, he demanded submission. Not just from his worshippers, but from the entire world. For centuries, Ashur remained a humble trading post. But when the Bronze Age collapsed and kingdoms around them faltered, when cities fell to famine, invasion, and internal rot, Assyria did something different. It adapted. It watched the weakness of others and learned. And then, like a wolf, sniffing opportunity, it began to expand. It started small. Local rivals were absorbed one after another. But unlike other empires that simply annexed territory, Assyria perfected the science of conquest. They didn't just win battles, they made them unforgettable. Each campaign was a message, and each message was written in human flesh. Resistance wasn't met with taxation. It was met with obliteration. Cities that stood against Assyria found themselves erased, not just conquered, humiliated. Heads of kings were nailed to walls. Rebellious citizens were skinned alive, their remains displayed publicly as warnings to the next village. Entire populations were forced into chains and marched hundreds of miles into foreign lands, not because Assyria needed workers, but because erasing identity was the fastest way to kill resistance. You can't rebel for your homeland if you don't remember what it looked like. But the Assyrians were not mindless butchers. Their terror was mathematical. Every horror was deliberate, a calculation. If one flayed enemy could make 100 cities surrender in fear, it was efficient. Every monument carved into palace walls, depicting impalement, siege, and mutilation, wasn't just art. It was propaganda, a psychological weapon embedded in stone. And it worked. As neighboring kingdoms fell, Assyria grew into a colossus. Its armies, the most disciplined in the world, marched with coordination unseen in the ancient world. They used iron weapons when others still clung to bronze. They constructed massive siege engines, battering rams, and mobile towers. They surrounded cities, cut off supplies, poisoned wells, and waited. Victory was not a question, it was a process. With each conquest came tribute, gold from Urartu, cedar from Lebanon, horses from the plains, slaves from everywhere. The wealth flooded into Nineveh and Kalhu, where palaces rose like mountains. Massive libraries, gardens, temples, and storehouses transformed the Assyrian heartland into the beating core of the known world. But even more than gold or land, Assyria craved something else: permanence. They didn't want to be just another warlord kingdom. They wanted empire, the kind of empire that would be remembered long after their bones were dust. So they built roads, administrative systems, tax bureaus, and a postal network. Governors were appointed, and detailed reports flowed back to the capital, tracking everything from crop yields to troop movements. This was no longer a kingdom. It was a machine. A brutal, gleaming, smoke-belching machine of control. Yet, and here is the great contradiction, this machine was also beautiful. In its cold efficiency, its architectural grandeur, its relentless ambition, there, was something mesmerizing. The Assyrians built great canals to feed their cities, imported exotic plants for royal gardens, and developed complex cuneiform records that preserved everything from epic poems to astronomical records. They weren't just warriors. They were engineers, poets, and visionaries, at least for those inside the palace gates, but only inside those gates. For the conquered, Assyria was a nightmare, a distant, faceless terror, the kind that haunted the imagination. Even centuries later, the Hebrew Bible still remembered them as destroyers of Israel. Jonah, the reluctant prophet, begged God not to send him to Nineveh, not out of cowardice, but because he didn't think such evil people deserved redemption. And yet, there were moments of fragility too. The Assyrians, for all their power, feared the gods. Their kings were obsessed with omens. A solar eclipse might cause a monarch to flee his throne. A failed liver reading during a sacrifice might delay an entire military campaign. Behind the walls of Nineveh, beneath the iron masks of their generals, they were still human, afraid of fate, disease, and rebellion. So we must ask, were the Assyrians truly evil, or were they simply the first to industrialize the darkness we all carry? Their empire wasn't built on ideology. It was built on the brutal truth that fear works, that people will bow faster to terror than to hope, that the memory of one flaying will silence 1,000 voices. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because in ways both subtle and terrifying, the world has never quite unlearned that lesson. What makes a kingdom turn into a machine? By the 8th century BCE, Assyria was no longer merely expanding, it was consuming. Entire regions from Egypt to Iran began to feel the slow crush of its ambition. And yet, unlike empires that grew fat and complacent, Assyria sharpened itself with every conquest. Each war made it more lethal. Each rebellion only refined its response. One name begins to stand above the rest: Tiglath-Pileser III. He wasn't just a general. He was an architect of empire, a master of reform. When he took power in 745 BCE, the empire was bloated and fractious. Regional governors had too much autonomy, and the armies were composed of unreliable, conscripted levies. Tiglath changed all of that. He centralized power, replaced hereditary nobles with appointed officials loyal only to him, and professionalized the military. Imagine it. Standing armies, year-round campaigns, soldiers equipped with iron armor, bows with complex compound structures, and engineers who could level walls or build bridges in days. This was no longer warfare. It was logistics. It was science. Under Tiglath and later Sargon II, the empire turned cold and clinical in its domination. Not only were enemies crushed, their entire societies were uprooted. The Assyrians began what would now be called ethnic engineering. Tens of thousands were deported, villages emptied, and their people were marched to faraway cities where they would be absorbed, controlled, and erased. The deportations weren't chaotic. They were planned with ruthless care. Officials logged names. Supply routes were organized. Soldiers marched the prisoners through scorching heat and frozen passes. Death was not unexpected. It was calculated into the process. And what of the cities they left behind? Many were resettled with Assyrian loyalists. Others were left as ghost towns, silent warnings. These weren't just acts of war, they were acts of reprogramming, cultural memory, religion, family lineage. Everything was shattered and rewritten under the Assyrian banner, and those who resisted, they didn't last long enough to regret it. Torture was spectacle, public. The Assyrian kings didn't hide what they did. They advertised it. Relief carvings from this period show shocking detail. The flaying of nobles, the cutting off of ears and noses, soldiers smiling as they stacked enemy heads like grain. These images weren't accidental. They were mass-produced and embedded in palace walls, watched by servants, ambassadors, visiting rulers, a constant visual drumbeat of what power looked like. And yet, amid this darkness, the empire glittered. Nineveh rose as a jewel of the ancient world. So too did Kalhu, modern Nimrud, and Dur-Sharrukin. Palaces taller than trees, rooms lined with alabaster reliefs, fountains fed by aqueducts stretching dozens of kilometers. Foreign dignitaries marveled at the engineering. Traders brought silk from the east and tin from Anatolia. Gold flowed into temples like rainfall. It wasn't just blood that built Assyria, it was brilliance. The empire even adopted and adapted foreign technologies. From the Hittites came chariot innovation, from Babylon the intricacies of writing, from Elam metallurgy. And rather than destroy the knowledge of conquered peoples, the Assyrians often assimilated it, then improved it, folded it into their great bureaucratic structure like parchment into a scroll. The bureaucracy itself was immense. Scribes recorded every tax, death, and decree. Messengers rode day and night through royal roads maintained with almost obsessive precision. Local governors filed monthly reports. Spies monitored vassals and returned coded reports to the king's inner circle. It was ruled not only by fear, but by paper, parchment, and clay. But here's the twist. Assyria didn't call itself evil. It believed it was divine. Each conquest, each mutilation was justified by the will of Ashur, their supreme god. The king was more than a man. He was Ashur's mouth on earth. To defy him was to defy heaven itself, and that gave their cruelty moral cover. It's easy to judge from the outside. But within that worldview, the violence wasn't villainy. It was cosmic justice. Even enemies were expected to accept this. The Assyrian annals often record letters sent to rebellious kings before battles. These letters urged submission, obedience, tribute. And if the enemies refused, the consequence was not just defeat, it was erasure. Families were exterminated, genealogies broken, the names of cities scratched off from maps. And yet, Assyria was never secure. Even at the height of its power, paranoia ruled. Portents were sought before battles. Priests read the entrails of sacrificed sheep. An eclipse might send a general home in terror. A royal illness could trigger riots in border provinces. Because the Assyrians, for all their steel and fire, knew the empire was only ever one revolt away from collapse. And revolts did happen, often fiercely. In Babylon, in Urartu, in the deserts of the Levant, local rulers plotted and schemed. Entire years of military campaigns were spent chasing shadows of rebellion. Some cities were destroyed 3 or 4 times over a single generation, only to rise and resist again. Assyria never stopped moving. It couldn't. To pause was to invite collapse. And so it marched. East, west, north, and south. Always hungry. Always sharpening the blade. But with each step forward, something was left behind: trust, culture, peace. The Assyrian people became more militarized, more isolated, more afraid. Not of enemies, but of each other, of their kings, of the gods, of failure. Because in a world ruled by fear, no one ever sleeps well, and deep in the shadows, the seeds of revenge were being sown, quietly, patiently, with the same attention to detail that Assyria once used to conquer the world. At the height of its power, Assyria did something almost no empire dares to do. It crowned a scholar. His name was Ashurbanipal, and unlike the blood-drenched conquerors before him, he was raised not only among soldiers and priests, but among scribes. While his brothers learned the art of siege and spear, Ashurbanipal learned Akkadian, Sumerian, and Elamite. He studied omens, read medical texts, memorized myths. He could recite the Epic of Gilgamesh before he was 12, but don't be fooled. He was no gentle king. Ashurbanipal was perhaps the most terrifying paradox in ancient history. A ruler who could both massacre a nation and annotate a library catalogue in the same breath. His rule, which began in 669 BCE, marked the final and most sophisticated phase of the Assyrian Empire. With the military infrastructure already perfected by his predecessors, Ashurbanipal turned his attention toward consolidation, culture, and cruelty. Let's begin with the grandest symbol of his mind, the Library of Ashurbanipal. Built in Nineveh, it was the greatest collection of knowledge the world had ever seen. Tens of thousands of tablets, covering everything from astronomical records to erotic hymns, were copied, preserved, and classified. Clay cuneiform tablets were stored in rows, labeled by topic and author, ancient Dewey Decimal carved by hand. He didn't just preserve his own culture. He sent emissaries to distant lands to collect the stories and sciences of others. Babylonians, Sumerians, Egyptians, all recorded on baked clay, It was a library for eternity, designed to survive him. And yet, while he curated knowledge with precision, he also practiced war with an artist's eye. In 653 BCE, he turned his gaze to Elam, a rival kingdom to the east. The campaign against Elam was not just a conquest, it was a theater of revenge. The Elamites had dared support rebellions in Babylon, and Ashurbanipal would make them pay, not with a simple defeat, but with total annihilation. His soldiers didn't just kill. They dismembered, decapitated. They dug up Elamite royal graves and smashed the bones. They carved out the hearts of princes and burned their cities to ash. The Elamite king's head was taken as a trophy, displayed in Nineveh like a grotesque artifact. But the most chilling part, Ashurbanipal wrote about it. Personally, in letters and annals, he described the destruction in cold, precise prose. He wrote not with regret, but with pride. The same hand that protected myths of the flood inscribed the record of genocide, and those records were carved into palace walls, scene after scene of flayed enemies, kneeling kings, and bound captives. Visitors to the palace could not avoid them. They were everywhere. Even the throne room floor was made of limestone tiles depicting defeated enemies beneath the king's feet. There was no escape from the message. This is what happens to those who defy Assyria. But as he cultivated fear abroad, Ashurbanipal's power at home began to fray. His brother Shamash-shum-ukin, whom he had appointed king of Babylon, grew restless. Ashurbanipal treated him not as an equal, but as a subordinate. Babylon, proud and ancient, chafed under Assyrian control. And so, in 652 BCE, Shamash-shum-ukin rebelled. What followed was civil war, brother against brother, city against city. Ashurbanipal laid siege to Babylon for 4 brutal years. The rivers ran dry, famine set in, citizens ate their dead. The walls of Babylon, long thought unbreakable, cracked under the strain. When the city fell, Ashurbanipal showed no mercy. He slaughtered nobles, priests, and children alike. The flames devoured the temples. The rebellion was erased by fire, blade, and decree. And still, he wrote, he recorded every detail, every name, every shrine he burned. As if by writing it down, he could not only justify the act, but immortalize it. His reign continued for years after. Campaigns in Arabia, suppression of rebels in Egypt, construction projects in Nineveh, public games, divine rituals, and astronomical observations. But something had changed. The machine was beginning to slow. Not because Ashurbanipal lost his edge, but because the system he ruled had reached its breaking point. Rebellions took longer to suppress. Governors grew bolder in their corruption. The provinces stretched too far, and the loyalty that once could be bought with silver now required armies. Ashurbanipal himself aged. And with age came paranoia. He sought omens constantly, sacrificed animals by the thousands to divine the future, built shrines in secret, consulted mystics in the dead of night. He too feared the fate that had claimed so many before him, and when he died, the empire trembled. No one knows exactly when he passed. Some say around 627 BCE, others say earlier. The records become vague, like sand drifting over stone. What is clear is this. With Ashurbanipal's death, the last truly capable Assyrian king was gone. The empire did not collapse that day, but the cracks became canyons. Multiple heirs claimed the throne. Civil war returned. Provincial leaders stopped, responding to orders. The army, once the pride of the world, fractured into factions. Assyria had taught the world to fear it. But now it feared itself. And in the east the Medes were watching, so were the Babylonians, and they remembered. They remembered the flayings, the deportations, the walls lined with skulls, the libraries filled with stolen myths, the gods humiliated. The brothers burned alive. They remembered and they prepared, because fear is a sharp sword, but once it slips from your hand, it cuts both ways. It didn't collapse in a day, no empire ever does, but the end of Assyria was not a quiet fading. It was a storm, centuries in the making and weeks in the breaking. After Ashurbanipal's death, The empire he forged with blood and stone began to unravel like a tapestry pulled at the seams. His heirs, weak, paranoid, and power-hungry, fought each other instead of fighting for the empire. Governors declared independence. Generals plotted treason. The royal court, once so feared, became a theatre of whispers and daggers. But the most dangerous enemy came from without. In the highlands of Media, a new power was rising. The Medes, fierce mountain-born warriors with a long memory of Assyrian oppression. To the south, Babylon, though repeatedly crushed, had never forgotten its status as a sacred city. And now, under a cunning leader named Nabopolassar, Babylon wanted vengeance more than it wanted freedom. In 616 BCE, the Medes and Babylonians did something no one had dared before. They allied, and when they marched, they didn't stop. City by city, fortress by fortress, they dismantled the outer layers of Assyrian control. Once, a whisper that the Assyrians were coming could make cities surrender without a fight. Now it was the Assyrians who were whispering about supply shortages, desertions, and strange dreams sent by angry gods. Nineveh, once thought impregnable, braced itself. By 612 BCE, the coalition had reached its gates. What followed was one of the most brutal sieges in ancient history, not just for its violence but for its symbolism. Nineveh was not just a capital, it was the heart of the Assyrian psyche. Every brick was propaganda. Every relief on every wall was a memory of victory carved in stone. And now the world had come to erase it. The siege lasted months. The Medes brought war engines and fierce infantry. The Babylonians brought strategy, engineers, and political momentum. Day by day they chipped away. The outer walls cracked. The rivers surrounding Nineveh were diverted to flood parts of the city. Crops failed. Disease spread. Assyrian soldiers, once invincible, began to starve, hallucinate, and mutiny. Inside, the king Sinsharishkun prayed. He made sacrifices. He begged the gods. But the gods were silent. Perhaps they were tired of blood. And then, the gates fell. No one knows how many died that night. The fires consumed libraries, palaces, temples, and towers. The great Library of Ashurbanipal, the most precious archive in the ancient world, was reduced to ash and cracked clay. Statues of kings were dragged through the streets. Their heads were hacked off and kicked into the Euphrates. Assyrian nobles were executed publicly. Soldiers were butchered or enslaved. Women were taken. Children vanished into the chaos. Nineveh, the city of fear, became the city of silence. And just like that, the Assyrian Empire ceased to exist. The survivors scattered. Some fled to remote fortresses, clinging to the illusion of continuity. Others disguised their identities, hoping to live out quiet lives far from the legacy of terror. But the Assyrian name, once carved into the bones of the world, was now toxic. No one wanted to be Assyrian anymore. But it is not so easy to kill an idea. Assyria, in its death, became myth. The Babylonians wrote of its fall with relish, painting themselves as divine avengers. The Medes expanded quickly, taking pieces of the fallen kingdom. Even the Hebrews, who once prayed for deliverance from Assyrian wrath, wrote poetry about Nineveh's fall, as if watching the monster drown gave them permission to breathe again. But none of them erased Assyria, because even in ruin the ghost of the empire lingered. The roads it built were still used. The systems of taxation and governance, adopted by Babylon and later by Persia, the techniques of terror, refined by empires from Rome to Stalin, and the stories refused to die. In the 19th century, Western archaeologists rediscovered the ruins of Nineveh and Nimrud. What they found shocked them, not only the art and architecture, but the level of documentation. Stone after stone described victories in exacting detail, how many prisoners were taken, how many flayed, how many impaled. Reliefs showed kings, hunting lions not for food but for sport, an allegory of power. And in those carvings a terrible beauty was preserved, because Assyria, for all its brutality, was not mindless. It was deliberate, and deliberate evil is the kind that haunts us most. We can understand rage, even cruelty and passion, But Assyria was cruelty in policy, cruelty in law, cruelty in ceremony. It institutionalized terror. And when that kind of power dies, it doesn't disappear, it seeps into history, into language, into the very bones of how we govern, how we fear, how we remember. That is why the fall of Assyria is not just an ancient event, it is a warning, because what Assyria built was not just an empire of conquest, it was an empire of psychology. It turned fear into fuel, it made obedience a currency, and it perfected the illusion that a boot could stay on the neck of the world forever. But no empire lasts forever, and when the boot finally lifts, the footprint it leaves behind is not just physical, it's moral. Empires die. That's the one universal truth history keeps whispering, no matter how loudly emperors shout. But Assyria refused to die quietly. Even in death, it left fingerprints on the world, not just in broken statues or crumbling ziggurats, but in the ways we build, rule, conquer, and remember. Centuries passed. The Babylonians who helped destroy Nineveh were themselves conquered by the Persians. The Persians fell to Alexander. Alexander's empire shattered into fragments that Rome later gathered into its cloak. And through it all, shadows of Assyria moved silently beneath the marble. Rome, that great student of empire, copied Assyrian systems of roads, taxation, and military conscription. Their legions marched with the same cold logic. Their emperors styled themselves as gods, and when they punished rebellion, they borrowed the same language of fear, crucifixions lining roads, public executions in arenas, all performances echoing what Assyria had once carved into palace walls. Even further, east, in empires like the Achaemenid Persians and later the Caliphates, echoes of Assyrian governance can be traced. Provincial governors, tribute networks, the integration of conquered elites into ruling classes. So the question becomes, if Assyria was evil, why did the world imitate it? The answer is uncomfortable, because cruelty works. For a while, fear can unify, it can motivate, it can control. And for a time, it can build something magnificent, but it can never sustain. It poisons the very ground it claims to hold, and the longer it lasts, the more it eats itself from within. That is the true tragedy of Assyria. It wasn't that it was cruel. History has no shortage of cruelty. It was that it systematized it. It made brutality not a vice but a virtue. It didn't just tolerate oppression. It celebrated it. It built monuments not to gods but to domination. And yet beneath that horror something else persisted. A desire to be remembered, to be eternal. That's why they carved their names into stone. That's why they built libraries. That's why they wrote everything down, even their atrocities. They feared death more than guilt, and in a strange way, they succeeded. Because we remember them, not with admiration, but with a chill, and the irony is sharp. The very methods they used to instill fear, stone reliefs, written records, dramatic architecture, are the same tools that ensured their legacy would outlive their empire. They wrote their nightmares into history, but memory is not obedience. Remembering is not the same as revering. And now, millennia later, we can finally look at Assyria with clear eyes, not as monsters, but as a mirror. Because in their story, we see patterns we still repeat. Leaders who mistake fear for respect. Nations who believe power is proof of righteousness. Systems that crush identity in the name of unity. And empires that think they will last forever. Assyria teaches us the oldest lesson in history. It is easy to build an empire. But it is far harder to build one that deserves to last. There is no monument, no wall, no army strong enough to protect a regime built only on pain. Even the greatest kings, even Ashurbanipal, with all his books and brilliance, could not write themselves out of consequence. So what then is left? In the ruins of Nineveh, archaeologists have uncovered fragments of a poem. Written in cuneiform, it speaks not of war, but of loss. It mourns the fall of a city, the silence of gods, the weight of forgotten names. And in that silence, we hear something else. the voice of every civilization that ever rose too high, too fast on the bones of those it crushed. History does not forget. It waits, and when it speaks in the language of consequence. So let us not just remember Assyria as the first empire of evil. Let us remember it as a warning carved in stone that power without mercy is empty, that fear is never eternal, that the blade always returns to the hand that wields it, and that in the end all empires fall. But only a few are cursed to be remembered not for what they built, but for how they made the world bleed.